So good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to open the annual conference of the Israeli Association for the Study of European Integration, which marks the 29th anniversary of the association, almost 30 years next year. We'll have opening remarks at our the beginning of the panel with our keynote speaker at 4 o'clock. Professor Daniela Schwarzer will talk about the implications of the German elections on the European Union. So I hand the introduction Zoom floor to Dr. Lior Herman, the chair of the panel, please.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, so good morning for the third time. And now that you've had the chance of experiencing Israel as a startup nation, we will start. So I'm delighted to open the first panel of the association's annual conference. Our theme is EU-Israel Relations. My name is Lior Herman. I'm faculty at the Department of International Relations at the Hebrew University. EU-Israel relations have always had their ups and downs. If I can paraphrase Heraclitus, one can argue that these relations are underlined by the concept of unity of opposites. They coexist on contradictions and opposites, and yet depend on each other, and thus unity, harmony, and cooperation always exist alongside tensions and constant struggles. This session will be devoted to explore this issue in historical and contemporary perspectives. In many respects, the three papers presented here examine EU-Israel relations not as bilateral relations, but as trilateral relationship. There is always an additional partner which shapes EU-Israel relations, either explicitly or implicitly, the Palestinians, directly or indirectly through Arab countries. We have three excellent speakers today, Naama, Barak, Sion-Tzidkiyahu, and Alfred, Tovias. We will continue in the order presented in the program, and I will introduce each speaker before she begins. Each speaker will have 15 minutes to present. In order to stimulate discussion, we will first hear the three presentations and then continue with the questions and answers. So I ask speakers to keep their time, 15 minutes. And as for questions, if you would like to ask questions, please write your name in the chat box. After all three presentations are over, I will call those who wish to ask a question by the order that they registered in the chat box. Okay, so our first speaker is Ms. Naama Barak. Naama is a PhD candidate at the European Forum. Her research focuses on development of the European Community's policy on the Arab-Israel conflict in the 1970s. Under the supervision of Professor Eli Podeh and Dr. Gadi Hyman, Naama aims to shed light on the historically unexplored chapter in the European Community's foreign policy. Naama's main areas of academic interests are Europe, Middle East ties, Middle East history, and the Arab-Israeli conflict. When she's not working on her research, she's a huge news junkie, a passion not diminished by years spent working as an editor and writer at Israel's leading English language news outlets. So Naama will present All for Europe or Peace in the Middle East, what a historical case study can reveal regarding opposing narratives on the resolution of the Israeli-Arab conflict. Naama, please.
Thanks, Leo. Hi, good morning. Let me share my screen with you. So as Leo said, I'm going to present a presentation called All for Europe, or Peace in the Middle East. And it's part of my PhD studies. I hope you find it interesting. So first of all, a short introduction. Outside of this room, when people think of actors that have sought to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict, Europe isn't generally the first that springs to mind, but that's not for their lack of trying. The European Community, which was the predecessor of today's EU, tried to resolve the conflict already back in the 1970s. And the Arab-Israeli conflict was actually the first case of foreign policy to be tackled by the EC. The EC had three aims in resolving the conflict. One was to strengthen itself by forming a collective foreign policy. The second was to guarantee oil security vis-a-vis the Arab world. And the third was to reduce military conflict in the Middle East. It had three means of doing so. The first was declarations, which I'll expand upon in a moment. The second was a financial framework called the Euro-Arab Dialogue. And the third was coordinated voting at the United Nations General Assembly. Now, I'm going to focus this morning on three declarations issued in 1973, 1977, and 1980. The first declaration recognized the Palestinians. The second called for a Palestinian homeland, and the third advocated for Palestinian self-determination. All of these declarations' narratives had to do with Palestinian rights, but in Israel, they were understood to have more to do with oil security and with appeasement to the Arab world. The question that's leading this part of my research is what can analysis of Israeli reactions to the declarations show us regarding the EC's role in the resolution of the conflict? And my main argument will be that Israeli reactions to the EC's declarations display a large gap in the narratives of the two sides, and also that Israeli reactions to European policy were negative, and therefore reflect the lack of trust and dialogue between the parties, as well as Israel's dismissal of the European community as a relevant mediator during the 1970s. The question arises as to why does this matter? Aside from the fact that it matters to me, I think that this case study can highlight a historical actor that attempted to play a major role in the resolution of the conflict. I think that it also proves that the EC's efforts brought to the fore ideas and notions that still guide us today, some 40 years later. It also offers a historical perspective on a decades-long process, and it offers an opportunity to analyze the normative dimension of the EC policy on the conflict. My methodology is a straightforward historical methodology. I'm using historical data in the form of press articles from the leading Israeli newspapers of the time. So I have news reports, editorials, analyses, and so on. And specifically, I'm examining Israeli press coverage of the EC's 3 declarations in order to analyze the influence that these EC principles had on Israeli public and media discourse during the 1970s. The first declaration which I'm tackling is the Brussels Declaration, which was issued in November 73, following the October 73 war and the ensuing oil crisis in Europe. That oil crisis led to European countries scrambling for bilateral deals with Arab oil producing countries. And all this was happening at the time when the EC was trying to champion a coordinated foreign policy. Some harmony was finally achieved in November when the 9 foreign ministers of the EC member states issued a declaration on the situation. The principles of the Brussels Declaration very much reflected UN Resolution 242, the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by force, the need for Israel to end territorial occupation, and it called for the respect of the sovereignty of every state. The novelty here was that it mentioned the legitimate rights of the Palestinians, and it noted that these must be considered in order to achieve peace. This was a big deal for 2 main reasons. The first is that it was actually the first time that an organ of the international community recognized the Palestinians as Palestinians and not just as refugees. And it challenged the accepted framework for dealing with the conflict by putting the Palestinians at the fore and making them a condition for the conflict's resolution. Now, some scholars argue that Europe's declaratory response to the crisis was driven by fears over oil security, and that was basically pandering to Arab oil-producing countries. And this view was also definitely the prevalent one in Israel, as analysis of press sources show. Here I have a few examples for you. Here we have a Jerusalem Post article saying that the common market, the European community, backed the Arabs' position. We have Prime Minister Golda Meir calling Europe stand a Munich attitude. Here we see what people thought of German neutrality on the matter. Here we have a headline calling the decision anti-Israel and saying that Western Europe capitulated to oil pressure and showed moral bankruptcy. And here we have oil blackmail, and these sort of headlines were very prevalent. Now, generally, in the analysis of the press sources, we can see that there's recognition of European failure to coordinate a European and overall European response. There was really widespread agreement that Europe was pandering to Arab oil-producing countries. And there was also recognition, as we saw from the cartoon, that traditionally pro-Israel countries, such as Germany, shifted toward the Arab position. The next declaration, which I'm tackling, is the London Declaration, issued in June 77, soon after the Likud party came to power in Israel. And it was also issued amid US President Carter's efforts to rejuvenate the Middle East process. In the declaration, the 9 reiterated the points they made back in 1973, but they added that the Palestinians have a legitimate right to express a national identity and that they need a homeland to do so. Again, this proved a shift in the paradigm of the resolution of the conflict, because for the first time, it turned the issue of a Palestinian homeland into a core condition for the resolution of the conflict. And now, while Europeans spoke only of a homeland and not of a state for the Palestinians, the intention was perfectly clear to Israelis who remembered their own declaration on the homeland back in the 1917 Balfour Declaration. Again, I have a few examples from press sources at the time. Here we have an editorial calling the member states the Nimble Nine and saying that the declaration reeked of oil. We have this recognition that the declaration marks a substantial policy shift. Here it's called an unprecedentedly sharp document. And interestingly, in the headline, it refers to a Palestinian homeland, but in the text, it's already referring to a Palestinian state. So this double entendre was clear to everyone. And there was also Prime Minister Menachem Begin, who responded very sharply to the declaration. He used Holocaust rhetoric, and here there's a quote of him saying that European blood was soaked with Jewish soil, and so on. In general, Israeli press recognized that there was European displeasure with the political climate in Israel at the time. There was recognition of Europe's concern over its oil security. There was also a rather nuanced understanding that the EC tried to make a statement that was independent, yet not completely out of line with US policy. There was a Holocaust rhetoric by Begin, and overall there was really diminished appreciation of Europe's sincerity in its concern for Palestinian rights. The next declaration is the most famous one, the Venice Declaration from 1980, and it was issued in June 1980, following European disappointment over American failure to deal with the Palestinian dimension of the Arab-Israeli conflict in the Camp David process. As such, it greatly stressed the issue of Palestinian rights and representation, and it determined that the Palestinians had a right to exercise self-determination and that the PLO had the right to be associated with these negotiations. The declaration, in a move called Getting Your Retaliation in First, the declaration actually got a negative response before it was even issued. Begin, for example, said that Germany, a member state, had no right to call for the recognition of the PLO, a group of murderers acting against a safe haven of Holocaust survivors. And not everyone shared these sentiments, but even they thought that Europe was more interested in appeasing Arab rejectionists than they were in advocating for the Palestinians. Here we have the cabinet's resolution. It's couched in Holocaust terms. The PLO is called the Arab Assess, and so on. Here we have an analysis calling the declaration a kiss of death. This is my favorite headline, calling the EC the merchants of Venice. Again, we have recognition that the declaration was pro-Arab, but not completely anti-American. It was in line with Americans. Here we have accusations of Western hypocrisy. Here we see that not all cabinet ministers were pleased with Begin's response to the declaration, but still a general agreement that Europe was rolling out the red carpet for Arab countries at Israel's expense. To summarize, there was really general outrage at the declaration. There was a return to the theme of oil greed and of appeasement. Like we saw, the cabinet response was couched in the Munich surrender terms. And Begin's response really wasn't unanimously popular. And some politicians, such as Abba Eban, for example, decried his cheap Holocaust rhetoric and called it useless. Interestingly, there was also interest in the Israeli press in the negative Arab and Palestinian response to the declaration, because the Arab countries and the Palestinians thought that the declaration, in fact, did not go far enough. I have a number of conclusions. The first is that the EC consistently advanced in its position that Palestinian rights were a central component of the resolution of the conflict, and that the Israeli response was equally consistent. Time and time again, Israelis argued that it was oil, world politics, and issues of internal cohesion that determined European policy. The negative Israeli reception was unanimous. It crossed party lines, it crossed press sources, and while the criticism varied in style, its content was very much the same, with the bottom line being that Europe, in fact, did not care about the Palestinians, but about itself and at Israel's expense. We can see that the passage of time didn't really affect Israeli opinion, or didn't deteriorate it. Munich and pandering to Arab countries were mentioned both in 1973 and 1980, and the differences we see in the responses were based mainly on corresponding world events. Lastly, Israel was adamant that the EC's normative narrative on Palestinian rights was a cover for its more realistic aims. This meant that the two sides didn't speak the same language, and that the gap between the two narratives couldn't actually be narrowed to create a meaningful dialogue. We also see that Israel's lack of trust and dismissal of the EC as a relevant mediator goes to show that acknowledgement of the different parties' outlook and narrative is a vital condition for cooperation and mediation. And since this didn't exist, Europe, in fact, was prevented from playing a meaningful role in the conflict's resolution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Naama. You've got to mute you. And for helping us to close the time gap, the technical time gap that we had in starting. Okay. Our next speaker is Dr. Maya Sion-Tzidkiyahu. Dr. Sion-Tzidkiyahu is an adjunct lecturer at the European Forum of the Hebrew University, where we are now, and at the European Union Studies Program at Tel Aviv University. She's also the director of the program on Israel-Europe Relations at Mitzvim, the Israeli Institute for Regional Foreign Policies, and published regularly through Mitzvim in the website and in the media. For the past 5 years, she has been the co-president of the European Association for the Study of European Integration, our association here. Dr. Sion-Tzidkiyahu will present evaluating Israel-EU relations in the last decade, 2010 to 2019 and beyond. I will just remind everybody, if you have a question, please write your name in the chat box, and then I will call you in this order after we finish the 3 presentations. You have 15 minutes.
So, good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here and to be able to present my paper, which I'm going to publish very soon through the Mitzvim Institute, the Israeli Institute for Regional Foreign Policies. So it's really good time to receive. Sorry, now I hope you can hear me better. As I said, this decade is characterized by constant deterioration of EU-Israeli political relations, and the EU moved from declarations to deeds. Naama, maybe you can tell us if also the 1980s, the whole decade was such a decade of political deterioration. I don't remember such a long period of this phenomena. And then the second characteristic was that the EU moved from declarations to deeds. And first deed was the linkage policy, stopping the upgrade of the second action plan in 2009. And there were other possible upgrades that were stopped during the decade. And the second deed was the differentiation policy, where the EU differentiate between Israel within the 67 line and differentiate, and it does not apply the agreements beyond the 67 line, so within the settlements. The other step that the EU took was the labeling of goods from Israeli settlements that was published by the European Commission in 2015. Now, although trade volumes increased both in goods and in services, as you'll see in a moment, no new upgrade of relations took place. And this is the reason why I call this decade a decade of missed opportunities, or sort of the lost decade. So here you could see that the trade, both in goods and in services, increased during the decade. So those political relations, in some sense, you can say, did not harm the economic reality. But what I want to show is, I think there are those missed opportunities that do harm the development of the relations. You can see here that for 2020, and I think this year represents many years of the decades, the EU, well, obviously, you know, the United States is the most significant partner of Israel, but the EU is first economic partner of Israel, both in export and in import. And it's also the case with research. When it's come to government funding of research, the EU is the main contributor to Israel in that sense, in the field of aviation, especially after Open Skies Agreement, in the field of tourism. 70% of the flights, for example, from Israel are to Europe, to the EU, agriculture and other fields. So it's not surprising, but the current differentiation policy seems that it did not harm the economic relations with Israel, and we see the growth. And as I said, the harm is actually due to the linkage policy, the not upgrading the relations. So in terms of lost opportunities, they stem from first
because of this linkage policy that the EU took in 2009. And as I said, it actually linked the peace process between Israeli and Palestinians to the upgrade of EU-Israeli relations. This is the triangle that you can see, which is not so much the case in other relations between the EU and other countries. So the breakdown of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process activates the linkage policy and activates the stop of the upgrade that was just about to happen, right? In 2008, there was the second action plan and the relations were about to be upgraded. And I want to remind you that also in the Olmert and Livni period at the decade beforehand, between 2006, 2008, this was actually the period where there was a lot of initiation of negotiations on new bilateral agreements. And I can show you the timeline of this period. And what you see marked in green at the upper part of the timeline of Israeli-EU relations is actually the agreement. They were all conceived and the negotiations started during the Olmert-Livni period. So what you see during the decade is actually the fruit being materialized from a decade beforehand. So what Olmert and Livni began, the Netanyahu governments were able to conclude and to bring to a good finish line, but no new opportunities, hardly any new opportunities began during this decade. Which Netanyahu governments were part of the political issue between Israel and the EU. Okay, so the lost opportunities, actually, we can also take a look at them when we compare Israel relations to other ENP, other neighborhood policy countries. And then if we look at for example, Israel not only did not upgrade to the second action plan in 2000, that was concluded already in 2008, it did not conclude partnership priorities. There were some talks in 2016-17, and they were stopped because of the linkage policy. Israel did not start the third generation trade agreement with the EU because of the linkage policy, but we can look at the Canada CETA agreement with the EU. We can look at Georgia and I think Ukraine that has the deep and comprehensive free trade area, and Morocco and Tunisia started negotiation over this agreement. So only Israel, which is a perfect candidate to do so, and was actually almost on the brink of doing that in 2008, did not do that, and that's lost opportunities. The second deed that I mentioned that had to do actually with the guidelines of differentiating Israel within the 67 lines and the occupied territories almost brought to Horizon 2020 to Israel not to enter Horizon 2020. It was really in the last moment. It was 26th of November 2013 when Tzipi Livni arrived to Brussels. She sat with Ashton, and then Israel really in the last second entered this program. So it was almost not happening. And it took a lot of lobby and pressure from scientific and academic community here in Israel to actually push the Israeli government to enter Horizon 2020. And there are some lost opportunities actually due to Israel. If we look at Creative Europe, it was a negotiation that lasted for 3 years. The Netanyahu government was about to enter this program, and at the very last minute, Miri Regev pulled out and decided that because of the differentiation policy, it's not going to take part in this agreement or program. So some of the burden is definitely, maybe a lot of the burden, that's up to you to decide, is on Israel. So trying to conclude, and it's going to be a bit long conclusions, as always, sorry, I don't want to do a spoiler, but as always, the relations between Israel, I mean, we saw really nicely, I think, from Naama to my presentation, that things have not changed very much. There's ups and downs. The relations are very complex and turbulent. And the last decade was, as I said, characterized by the considerable political downturns to new lows. Sorry, I'm looking for the slide that's with with my main characteristics of the decades. So there was considerable political downturn to new laws, while the economic were flourishing, but it could have been better if the political relations would have been better. And also what characterized the second part of the decade is this divide, what I call divide and thwart. It's not divide and stop, but it is to thwart, to either very much weaken and soften or even veto EU decisions against Israel. So that was the Netanyahu government decision or policy that it acted vis-a-vis the EU. And for that, not only for that, but also for that cause, it put an emphasis on strengthening bilateral relations with EU member states. So we can talk about the Greece, Cyprus, what we call in Israel the Hellenic Alliance, that already took place in 2010, but in 2016 it was institutionalized. And Greek, I think it was the first country that Netanyahu managed to talk to its prime minister or foreign minister, and they did the thwart or softening of EU decision against Israel in January 2016. And then there was the relation with the Visegrad countries, and especially Hungary and Poland, where the relations were so strong that the Visegrad summit, the annual summit, was even about to take place here in Jerusalem. And it was only because of the Poland-Israel crisis over the 2018 Polish Act on the Institute of National Remembrance that canceled this summit at the very last moment. We can mention relations with Romania and Bulgaria and others. I'm not going to go into it. So there is much continuation, but there are also, as Lior mentioned at the beginning, and we see throughout the decades, the Israel-EU relations are not governed by the bilateral relations, but they are governed with this triangle, with this linkage, which was not formal and became formal in 2009, related to the peace process, or the lack of the peace process with the Palestinians. So in that sense, what happened during this decade was that the EU adopted what we called agreed language, the agreed language in its decision, which made the EU less flexible in its attitude towards Israel. It's much more difficult now to react to realities on the ground. So, for example, if we have a weak Palestinian Authority leadership, or if we have a new coalition government in Israel, that is extreme combinations between Bennett, Meretz, and Mahmoud Abbas in Israel. If we have normalization policy with Arab and Muslim countries, it's still not enough to change the EU decision. So to conclude, this decade was characterized by one-sided, proactive steps by the EU, and this open divide and thwart reactions from the Netanyahu government. And therefore, it's not surprising that this decade is characterized by lack of dialogue, the Association Council not taking place. I would like to finish with the end of the decade, or maybe the beginning of this new decade with 2020, with a much more optimistic note. It's also the lowest political point, with annexation on the table by the Israeli government. And with the move to normalization, we are moving to a much more optimistic, I hope, point. Foreign Minister Gabi Ashkenazi already began this, putting an emphasis, I think it was the first foreign minister of the decade, perhaps, to really put an emphasis on improving the relations with Europe and with the EU. He didn't succeed because he still had the burden of being a foreign minister under Netanyahu. But once we have a new government and Netanyahu is no longer the prime minister, and Lapid is the foreign minister, and the first visit he does in Europe is to Brussels. I think this is the first foreign minister ever in Israel that he was in Italy maybe for 24 hours beforehand, but never mind. Yeah, but he arrives to Brussels less than 1 month after this government is established. And I think this is amazing. and his attempt was to reconvene the Association Council. So it's too soon to tell, but the atmosphere in the current Israeli government has definitely changed. I think it will probably require also a visit in Paris to actually reinitiate the Association Council. And the last thing that I want to show you is, I think, why it's so important, not only because of those lost opportunities and the wish to actually upgrade EU-Israeli relations and to benefit us all as Israelis, as consumers here in Israel, but also because of the bad public opinion that this decade actually took a toll in Israel. So maybe Alfred, maybe you remember, but maybe it was 15 years ago or more. It's, my age is starting to show. But it was, the poll opinions of that Konrad Adenauer were making with Sharon Parder. 75% of Israelis wanted to join the EU, wanted us to be in the European Union, without knowing what it is. But also, this is a public opinion poll done annually by Mitvim. Since 2018, there is this question: would you define the EU more as a friend or as a foe to Israel? And you see that in 2018, 55% of Israelis thought that the EU was more a foe to Israel than a friend. And we see that, and I'll do a spoiler, Mitvim hasn't published it yet, so you're the first one to see it. In 2021, it's almost the same, as if we don't have a new government and there is no change of public opinion. It's a bit stable, and more than 40%, 45% of the Israeli population think that the EU is a foe, which is a complete, mistake in economic terms. Okay, so only thinking about it in political terms is not good enough. We need more knowledge about the EU. But I'm optimistic. I do want to finish on an optimistic note and to say that with the new government and with the new agenda of the foreign minister, there are many things on the agenda that were stopped during this decade and can now progress. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're now moving to our third speaker, Professor Alfred Tovias. Professor Tovias is a professor emeritus of the Department of International Relations at the Hebrew University. He was the chairman of this department from 2010 to 2012, a period which Dr. Sion-Tzidkiyahu just covered in terms of his EU relations. Before he served for 5 years as the director of the Leonard Davis Institute for International Relations, also here at the Hebrew University. He is also a Jean Monnet Chair on External Economic Relations of the EU. Since he retired, he has been a visiting professor in numerous places, such as the University of Geneva, the University of the Bundeswehr, University of Warsaw, University of Maastricht, and University of Valencia. He's also the co-president of the Israeli Association for the Study of European Integration, jointly with Dr. Sion-Tzidkiyahu. He's a member of the board of directors of FEMIS, as well as a member of the steering committee of Euromesco. Professor Tovias published in several books and articles, among others in the Journal of Common Market Studies, European Union Politics, Mediterranean Politics, Oxford Economic Papers, The World Economy, and West European Politics. His most recent book, co-edited with Amy Verdun, is a study mapping European economic integration. He's also been a consultant to the OECD, the World Bank, and UNCTAD. He will present his paper on EU's foreign policy on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, a reevaluation. Professor Tovias, you have 15 minutes, please.
I must switch the Zoom. Do you hear me?
No.
אבל המסך צריך...
לא, אבל גם שאתי כאן זה לבן על לבן, לא כך רואים טיפה את האור שם, אז הנה...
רגע, אתה צריך להעביר פה. כן? אוקיי. Do you see me? Okay. I'm going to present a thesis for once on the basis of a new paper going to appear in the Israel Journal of Foreign Affairs later this month. which has appeared already in the form of online, and where I clearly state, following a little what Maya said, that I am relatively optimistic about the future of those relations, but maybe for other reasons than Maya has mentioned. I will sum up the paper so that if I don't reach all the details, you have a sense of what I want to say. Well, I detect over the years a gradual shift that has taken place in the foreign policy of the European Union on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And this is due in large part to the recognition in the EU that peace will take much more time to achieve than was believed a decade ago. Therefore, there is a quite quiet convergence of the EU and Israeli positions that I can detect. And this is why I dare to say that there is, with precaution, a slight Israelization of the European Union. We used to debate with Lior, Herman, Guy Arpaz, and many of the experts in academia about EU-Israel relations 20 years ago, 10 years ago, and I used to say, like many others, that there was a Europeanization of Israel in adopting standards, etc., from the EU, etc., etc. However, politically speaking, but also in other aspects, there is an Israelization of the European Union. Looks pretentious. When I presented this once 5 years ago in Barcelona, they were laughing at me, but I think that my thesis stands. Of course, the big problem, and I could say that in the conclusion, is that Israel has not the luxury of being Turkey, okay? I hope that Israel does not make the error of Turkey, thinking that it is Turkey and that it can keep aloof of what the European Union is. There is this temptation, there can be this temptation, and I think this is very, very dangerous. You know that our association agreement was open-ended, and it is the only legal basis until now for EU-Israel relations since the year 2000, when it was entirely ratified by the European Parliament, the 15 member states of then, and Israel. And there was an association council at the ministerial level. It should meet every year, etc. It has not convened since 2012, following the near freeze in political relations more than a decade ago. Maya wants to detect deterioration from 2012. I am not so sure, but clearly there is a freeze. Since 2004, there was a change in the European foreign policy regarding our area, the European neighborhood policy. As you know, it was the idea that very much appealed to Israel to anchor economically Israel and other countries without offering them the prospect of full membership. It was attractive to Israel because it was bilateral, differentiated, according to the level of development of the neighbor and its needs. What Israel liked most was that it was an approach that favored carrots over sticks. The EU would apply so-called positive conditionality. It is true, I must say, that all this did not help much when in early 2009, the EU decided to freeze government-to-government relations. And this under, if I am not mistaken, under Olmert already started. And this as a result of Operation Cast Lead in Gaza. By then, however, as Maya insisted, two important sectoral agreements were in the making, and they included agricultural free trade between the two parties and the Open Skies Agreement, liberalizing commercial aviation between the EU and Israel. Now, I contend that in relation to the conflict, the EC was the one that transformed the conflict from a refugee issue to one of self-determination. And this shift was spurred by the Venice Declaration. So they contributed to shift Israel also in that direction. Now, what the EU did wrong from scratch, in my opinion, was to consider that EU, the Israeli side and the Palestinian side, was equivalent. There should be some symmetry between the two. There were two states to be created at a time where there was already a huge imbalance between the two countries. I give the example of this strange idea to give EMP agreement, to sign an EMP agreement, Euro-Mediterranean Partnership Agreement with the Palestinian Authority, as it were an independent country, as if there were no previous customs union agreement between Jerusalem and Ramallah, which was a kind, I must admit, a custom regime imposed by the occupier. The EU was officially treating the PA as it were just another Mediterranean non-member state like Israel. This to give the impression that the PA and Israel were on the same level. And it looked as if the EU was seeking to reduce economic asymmetry between Israel and the Palestinians. But as we know, this effort was largely unsuccessful. Already, the EU position on Israel changed slightly after 9/11, when it decided, among other things, to boycott Hamas later on. And therefore, this was, in my opinion, a sign that times were changing. It is true that the EU has consistently, officially, been based or has based its position on land for peace. And in order to maintain the possibility of a two-state solution, Israel and the EU said this is an economic matter and the EU can help. And actually, the EU is doing annual grants to the PA, as we know, since nowadays, I think the two-state solution for the EU doesn't wash if the EU does not grant this aid, because that would lead probably, in the assessment of the EU and Israel, to the collapse of the PA, and at the time when Oslo was alive, it would lead to the collapse of the Oslo process. Now, I detect a lot of changes in the bilateral relations since 2004. First, I start to speak about the changes in Israel, and then the changes in the European Union. The changes in Israel are evident to see for everyone. From modest beginnings as a small semi-industrialized country when I wrote my thesis in the 1980s, Israel has become a medium-sized advanced economy. More than half of its industrial exports originate in the high-tech sector, And then there was this discovery in 2009 of gas deposits, and exports of gas to Egypt, Jordan, and the PA are increasing by the day, etc., etc. Now, it is clear that all this is quite impressive, particularly for our neighbors in Southern Europe, like Greece, Cyprus, Bulgaria, and Romania. Political influence has risen clearly on this country since the discovery of gas. The influence on Poland, Hungary, Czechia, and Slovakia is well known, but actually, because of these discoveries, I think that Israel must rely less on these Eastern European countries for political, to get political push in Brussels, because there are these four democratic countries in Southeastern Europe that are very much understanding the Israel position. Now, probably the trade dependence of Israel on the EU will diminish because Israel has become a very important export of high-tech services, and high-tech exports are less distance sensitive than the products of other sectors. So Israel has been able to diversify its export markets and sales to India and China, which have become per se very important trade partners. So the reliance on the EU as an economic anchor is perceived, in my opinion, as less necessary than before. And OECD membership seems to be a good substitute for many Israelis in the establishment. Changes in the public opinion of Israel, I think that contrary to what my good friends in Europe tend to say, that Israelis have become fascist and narrow-minded and populist, etc., etc. I think that the second intifada has been fatal for those who were, like me, very much supportive to peace now. It is clear that no rational voter would push for a process that is perceived to lead to less security instead of more security. And therefore, it's very understandable that we are still under the spell of this terrible second intifada. That's first. Second, disappointment in leftist circles with the Gaza unilateral withdrawal. It's clear that many Israelis say, why withdraw? It doesn't help. There is in the West zero tolerance for terrorism. And this goes with the mentality in Israel that thinks that we shouldn't let go in face of terrorism. And then there is this wait and see attitude in Israel after the Arab Spring. Very logically, until the dust doesn't settle, in Israel, many people say, well, wait a minute, for example, regarding the Golan, to speak about something. Now, what are the changes in Europe? Well, the changes in Europe are very clearly the EU enlargement of 2004 and the entry of Eastern European countries that understand Israel apparently better because of the past, or maybe because of bad conscience, I don't know. But they have joined, say, the German camp rather than the French, Spanish, Irish camp. Then there is Arab Spring disappointment. Emmanuel Joffre, the former ambassador of the EC, told we are very disappointed with what goes on in Arab countries. And now Tunisia joins the fray. And then Turkey has become a real headache for the European Union. The European Union doesn't know what to do with them, and it is an important ally that is less of an ally before, and maybe that makes them think twice about Israel. Now, anti-Semitism Yeah, okay. Anti-Semitism has become another point. Anti-Semitism is intolerable for the European establishment. And that makes that the position regarding the importance of Israel for Jews in Europe is better understood. I am told that time is out. So in my paper, I will say what I say in my paper, you look at it. I give explanations for the ongoing official fees, and Europeans will say it's because Israel has not changed the settlement policy, etc. I beg to differ. The reasons are realpolitik reasons of the EU itself, but with time, the EU will understand that carrots work better with Israel than sticks. I think the progressive shift of the EU policy is simply because they now give priority to geopolitical, this new commission, geopolitical arguments, and geoeconomics. And therefore, the EU has a vested interest to keep the PA functioning like Israel, so there is convergence of opinion. Southeastern Europe is strongly pro-Israel, so therefore the conclusion is that sooner or later the association agreement, the Council will convene because the EU will realize that there is no point to press for, like Biden said, for a two-state solution now. The ground is not there for different reasons, and that Israel is too important to be ignored from the EU side. Mute.
Thank you very much, Professor Tovias. We are now moving to the question and answers. If you would like to ask a question, please write your name. We already have 3 questions. We'll take them first together. I don't know if we'll have time for another round. If you're in this table here, then just raise your hand. Okay. So I suggest the following. I see 4 questions altogether. We'll take the 4 questions. Please be brief. Make sure it ends with a question mark. And then we'll let the panelists answer. So the first question goes to Shai Moses.
Yeah, good morning, everyone, and lovely to be here at the annual meeting of the association. Again, appreciation of the association and appreciation for all the panelists for this panel. My question is to everyone in the panel. Given that in the last decade we saw this kind of stagnation in EU-Israel relations, my question is, how unique is it, this stagnation between these bilateral relations? Or maybe this is more coming from the EU perspectives with their kind of focus on internal matters, the Brexit, the refugees crisis, coronavirus pandemic crisis, etc. Do we have another example of a non-EU country with this kind of political disagreement that we saw actually some kind of upgrading in the bilateral relations that we can compare it to the EU-Israel case? And another question, if I may, is given this new...
I think Shai, we will stop here because we have a few more questions. Sure. And we don't have a lot of time.
Sure, pleasure.
Thank you. Okay, the next question goes to Talia Lador-Fresher. Talia, I think you want to ask a question from here so you can be heard.
So thank you all, and thank you very much, Naama, for showing us that there's nothing new under the sun. And thank you, Albert, for being so positive and saying that sooner rather than later the EC will convene. We're working hard on it. I hope you're right. My question actually goes to Maya. and that is regarding the poll of Mitvim, which is very interesting about Israelis' attitude towards the EU. This is something that is also part of what we do at the European Division in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And my questions to you is, isn't it an issue also of expectations? When you don't expect, you're not disappointed. When you have many expectations, like Israelis from Europe, this is part of it. So, and I wonder how this is, if and how this is part of the statistics.
Thank you. The next question comes from Dr. Emmanuel Blanc. She can't ask the question herself, so I will ask it for her. And she wants to challenge the optimistic view put forward by the panelists, given the fact that the breakthrough in the peace process with the Palestinians is clearly not a priority of the current Israeli government, and that the EU holds tight to its peacemaking conditionality. What are the chances for an association council to take place again in the near future? And the final questions comes from Dr. Yalin Bar. You want to answer from here so you can be heard? Yeah.
Again, thank you very much for inviting us here. It's always very interesting and fun coming here. I have a comment and a question. The comment is that even in the ENP, there was a reference to trading services, okay? And the trading services was, in fact, finally refused by Israel. I mean, we came, the EU came to Israel and said, let's open negotiations. Israel didn't want to. So it's not totally one-way street in this respect. The question I wanted to ask Maya is about the poll. I mean, I think, why did you choose the words foe and a friend? I mean, because if, according to what you say, people say, 45% of the Israelis believe the EU is an enemy. But there's a lot of gray area between these two extremes. So I wanted to know, why did you choose this extreme? Thank you.
Thank you very much. As I said, because of the technical problems that we had in the beginning, we don't have a lot of time. So I'll ask each of the speakers to answer. Take 2 minutes. We'll do it in the order that we started. Naama, do you have something you want to ask? You want to answer? Okay, so Maya.
Okay, thank you very much for the questions and comments. So, Talia, I think there is this expectations and disappointment in Israel. With Europe, we have a lot of emotional issues in this tie. It's not rational. It's not. There's a lot of cognitive dissonance in our relations with the EU. So that's part of it. But what I think, and my recommendation to Mitvim is to actually hold focus groups, to actually understand why, Alfred, you have this theory of the second intifada, and it's actually rational by the Israelis not to wish what the EU wants for Israel or Palestine, a two-state solution, so it's actually rational. I'm not sure, because 60% of the Israelis, about 60%, above the 50%, do wish a two-state solution. So that has not taken off, wasn't put off the table. So I want to have these focused groups to actually understand the Israeli psyche, okay? And that's my wish. With regards to Emmanuel Blanc, your question about the, Palestinians are not on the top of the priorities of the EU and not on top of the Arab countries' agenda as well. So, it seems that less and less actors in the world care about them. Biden is not putting that on the agenda. So that leaves us a question. Still, so many things have changed in the region, and we have so many challenges with Iran and with other movements, terror, military movements that are linked to Iran, and we have other problems, right? So, what is the EU going to do? Is it going to stick with this Venice Declaration from 1980, or is it going to be a bit more flexible? And I think with the normalization process, I think. Needs to be a bit more flexible. Definitely, I don't expect the EU ever to withdraw from the two-state solution. That's definitely not what I'm saying. On the contrary, I do want it to have a positive conditionality to that. And Alfred, there was the special privilege partnership in 2013. So yes, it was an empty proposal for Israel. If you and the Palestinians do sign a peace agreement, we will give you, the skies. there's not much into it by the EU. It was an empty agreement, and the EU told Israel, "So what do you want?" Right? And Israelis are not really good at answering what do we want from the EU, especially the government. So that's another thing, that recommendation that the government knows what it wants from the EU. And Eyal, you asked about the deep and comprehensive free trade area. Indeed, Israel missed an opportunity in 2008 when the EU suggested to the Israeli government, let's make a third generation trade agreement in services. The ministry, and I won't mention, I'll be diplomatic, but Israel said no. Okay, we're not able to do that. It's not it was not willing. I think it was more that it was not able. The decisions were not completely against, and the Ministry of Finance wants to push it very much forward. So it's a missed opportunity. If we would have begun that in 2008, that would have materialized into an agreement, and that's a lost opportunity by Israel. Definitely, that's on us. So I hope we won't miss the other opportunities, and I hope very soon it will be on the table. We need this. Trade in services is more than 50% now of Israel export. And this year, in 2020, I think it was the year when it was the biggest, it was bigger than goods, than export of goods. Why did Mitvim choose this faux friend? I was not working at Mitvim in 2018, so I don't know the question. I'll ask. It was troubling to me as well because it's too much. I guess because of the rhyme, but in Israel, it's in Hebrew, it's Yariv or Yadid. It's not Oyev in Hebrew, and the question is being asked in Hebrew. So the Hebrew translation is better. It's Yariv. It's an adversary. Okay. So.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sion-Tzidkiyahu and Professor Tovias.
Yes, I didn't understand what Shai Mohammed asked, but I will address briefly.
I'll just repeat. Shai basically asked what leads to stagnation. Is it coming from Israel or is it coming from the European Union? Is it because of domestic drivers within Israel or within the EU, or is it something that is more the relationship themselves, something else?
Well, to Shai, I would say.
Are you?
Unmute and video. Sorry. Yeah, to Shai, I would say that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict has a symbolic value for many Europeans. And we know that public opinion in Europe is much more pro-Palestinian than the Commission and the institutions in Brussels, which are more realpolitik oriented. But for the moment, public opinion is the one who has prevailed, I would say, in Brussels. And according to Mrs. van der Leyen, the president of the Commission, the EU wants now to take a more hard-nosed approach to politics and foreign policy. And therefore, the heck with public opinion, I am expressing myself openly. That's one way of answering. Now, so if the question is what drives this animosity, it's public opinion in Europe, in many important countries of the European Union. Now, the second thing I wanted to say is that to Maya, there is a paradox. We in Israel used to say that the EU has double standards because on the territories, they don't say the same thing about the Polisario and the Western Sahara. Now I have for you good news. Now they have decided to correct this irrationality, but not on the in the direction of Israel, but rather castigating Morocco for what they are doing in the Western Sahara. So but the argument, our argument, cannot be exerted anymore because the Commission will say, And the second thing I want to say is that it seems to me that the European Commission now is completely absorbed in Brussels regarding the Mediterranean on the Algerian-Morocco crisis. I don't know if you know that the two countries are on the verge of war. It's not well known here, but and then there is this gas problem. Gas comes to Spain and to all Southern Europe via Algeria and through Morocco. And Morocco and Algeria have broken their diplomatic relations for this Polisario thing. And therefore, I suppose that in Brussels, they are trembling about this. Because, as I say in the paper, the foreign policy of the European Union has switched now from values to stability at all costs. They know very well that Egypt is a ticking bomb, but never mind, Sisi, okay? And they know that in Jordan, it's not a ticking bomb, but it's because Israel is there in some sense. So, and America, but it's also a ticking bomb. So all this makes me think that they want stability here. They don't want more problems. Mute.
Thank you very much. I think this is, I certainly am leaving this discussion with a desire to continue it, and maybe we can do that in a break. There are many more questions to be asked. And I want to thank the three speakers for excellent presentations. I want to ask to thank the participants also for their questions. We will resume again at 11:05. We're running slightly behind schedule due to some of the technical problems we had. But before we end and conclude this panel, I'm going to hand it back to Dr. Sion-Tzidkiyahu for a very short YouTube clip.
So I want to share with you 3 minutes, a very new video clip that the association was producing together with the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung and with the Europe-Israel Network, which is a new association that wants to deal with the public opinion of Israelis about Europe. So please bear with me just for 3 more minutes, and I would also invite you to share it.
אירופה, מה היא בשבילך? ובשבילך?
כל מה שאירופה זה כזה מקום סודר כזה.
הנאה, שופינג, טיולים. אנשים שם קרים, אתם משלמים ביורו.
זה ארץ החלומות.
A role model for many countries. אוכל.
נימוסים.
אירופה זה תרבות.
שואה.
מלא ארצות כאלה שוות, אנשים פלצנים שעפים על עצמם.
והאיחוד האירופי?
הבעיה הכי גדולה באירופה זה האיחוד האירופי. יש גורמים בתוך האיחוד האירופי שמנסים לשנות את ישראל.
ליבם יוצא אל הפלסטינאים.
שנאת ישראל, נראה למנהיגים יותר.
בסקר שנערך בשנת 2020, עולה שכמעט חצי מהציבור בישראל חושב שהאיחוד האירופי יריב לישראל. האם זה כך? לא בדיוק. יש יותר סחר עם ארצות הברית או אירופה?
ארצות הברית.
לדעתי ארצות הברית.
לא בדיוק. הנה מפת הסחר העולמית של ישראל. ניתן לראות שעיקר הפעילות הכלכלית של ישראל מתבצעת עם האיחוד האירופי, והיא גבוהה מזו שמתבצעת עם ארצות הברית וסין. מזה עשרות שנים, האיחוד האירופי הינו שותף הסחר המוביל של ישראל. ומה קורה בהיבטים אחרים?
אין לי מושג. אני על הגדר.
תוכנית הורייזון 2020 של האיחוד האירופי נועדה לקדם ולעודד מחקר, פיתוח וחדשנות פורצי דרך. הסכום שקיבלה ישראל מתוכנית זו הינו 1,360 מיליון אירו, מימון למוסדות אקדמיים ול-960 חברות, מעל 15,000 חוקרים וחוקרות. כיום נפתחה ופועלת תוכנית הורייזון יורופ. תקציבה עלה ל-95.5 מיליארד אירו, ומכאן שעלה היקף ההזדמנויות למיזמים ישראלים, חברות, סטארט-אפים, מוסדות אקדמיים ורשויות מקומיות. ישראל משתתפת בתוכניות אלו מאז 1996, וזהו מנוע צמיחה משמעותי לכלכלה שלנו. אירופה הפכה לאחד ממנועי הצמיחה של תעשיית המחקר והפיתוח בישראל. תוכנית ארסמוס פלוס. יותר מ-15,000 סטודנטים, סטודנטיות וסגל הוראה זכו למלגות ולמוביליות אקדמית. בנוסף למימון, התוכנית מעניקה אפשרויות לשיתוף פעולה עם מוסדות הוראה אירופיים מובילים. סטודנטים ישראלים יכולים כחלק מהתואר שלהם לעשות סמסטר או שניים באירופה. והמימון? מהאיחוד האירופי. ומה קורה בתחום התיירות? על הסכם שמיים פתוחים שמעתם? 5 שנים להסכם שמיים פתוחים העלו משמעותית את כמות הטיסות לישראל וממנה. 70% מהנוסעים טסים לאירופה. ההסכם עם האיחוד האירופי הוריד דרמטית את מחירי כרטיסי הטיסה. מאז ההסכם הוכפל מספר הנוסעים בין ישראל ובין האיחוד האירופי. כל זה לא היה קורה ללא האיחוד האירופי.
האיחוד האירופי זה פרויקט מדהים, זה פרויקט של שלום בין מדינות שהיו קודם במלחמה.
לאחרונה תשומת לב מיוחדת ניתנת לנושאי סביבה וקיימות. הטיפול באנרגיה, מים, אוויר והטיפול בפסולת. האיחוד האירופי מוביל את העולם בתחום הזה. יש למצוא דרכים לחזק את הקשרים ולמצוא את האינטרסים המשותפים, מבלי להחליש את עמדותינו הפוליטיות. רב המחבר על השונה. חיזוק הקשר עם האיחוד האירופי זהו יעד אסטרטגי מן המעלה הראשונה עבור ישראל, ואתם קדמו את החלומות והיעדים שלכם. ענפו את ההזדמנויות הרבות המחכות לכם ולכן בקשרים הטובים והמועילים בין ישראל והאיחוד האירופי.
סדיצ'י?
זה נמצא בערוץ היוטיוב של האגודה, ואתם מוזמנים לשתף. It's on our YouTube channel.